As you may know, this is the 7th talk in our Diversity and U.S. Legal History series. We have 3 more coming your way. We have one on 1026 with Professor Gordon Reed. We have one on 11/2 with Professor Tamika Brown-Nagin. And Professor Ken Mack will round out the series on 11/16. All right, so today we have the distinct pleasure and honor of having with us Professor Katherine Franke, who is the Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where she also directs the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and is the faculty director of the Public Rights Private Conscience Project. She is amongst the nation's leading scholars writing on law, religion, and rights, drawing from a feminist, queer, and critical race theory. Her most recent book, Wedlocked: The Perils of Marriage Equality, considers the cost of winning marriage rights for same-sex couples today and for African Americans at the end of the Civil War. Wedlock anticipated a virulent, if not deadly, backlash against same-sex couples winning marriage rights. Professor Franke was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2011 to undertake research for Wedlock. In addition to her work at Columbia, she works regularly in Palestine, most recently serving as an academic mentor for the Human Rights faculty at Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem. And she also sits on the steering committee of the Academic Advisory of Jewish Voice for Peace. She also chairs the board of directors of the Center for Constitutional Rights based in New York City. And today she will be speaking to us on the Originalist case for reparations, from the Sea Islands to the movement for Black lives. We are so honored to have her. Again, for those of you in the back, come on down, let's fill in the room. We're so honored to have her. She will be speaking for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience. Because you guys are amazing, wonderful people, you will pay rapt attention, and you will ask wonderful questions. So without any further ado, please put your hands together for Professor Franke.
I'm good. Thank you. Oops. Hey, thank you so much for taking time out of your lunch. I understand lunch is a complicated thing here in this semester, so some of you are lunch-free on a fast to have solidarity with the strikers, and gotta love that. I am so happy to be here and not talk about marriage. I just had a book come out about marriage. It feels like all I've talked about forever. But I am here to talk about the complexity of what it is to be a rights holder, which is in some ways what the book about marriage was about. And my work more recently has shifted to the question of reparations, racial reparations in this country. So that's what I want to spend a little time talking about by returning to a particularly important period in U.S. history, which is really 1861 to 63 in South Carolina. A very granular historical kind of trip I'll take you on of what happened then, which I think is important for us to return to in order to understand the moral authority of the claim for reparations today. So as you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, or as many of you know, Coates wrote a really compelling piece in The Atlantic in June of 2014, in many ways sparking a new discussion about the underlying justification for racial reparations in this country. And then this summer, the Movement for Black Lives issued a comprehensive and stunning platform for action that went through a wide range of areas of social, economic, and legal injustice in this country, making very specific demands about what the problem is and how we ought to address it through particular policies. And reparations figured prominently in the Movement for Black Lives platform. And the notion there is that reparations in the platform, but also in Coates's work, is that it's not merely, not only something that would signify or represent a kind of repair for the torture, the soul killing that was chattel slavery in this country, but also its afterlife, lynchings, Jim Crow segregation, economic injustice or racial injustice that structures all of our lives in so many ways, environmental racism, education, schools, just the ways in which racism really structures American society. Movement for Black Lives and Coates have argued find their origin in chattel slavery in this country, but they did not find their end in the 13th Amendment or the emancipation of African American people. So part of what this project for me is doing is looking at the inadequacy of mere emancipation. Declaring people free, militarily at first, and then by policy second with the Emancipation Proclamation, executive policy, and then thirdly, constitutionally from the 13th Amendment, is of course necessary, but not a sufficient way to accomplish justice for enslaved people. And part of why race and racism continues to structure American society, in my view, is the inadequacy of that moment of thinking what full justice would have meant in the 1860s. And so what we see during that period is the notion of being freed, that's free with a D at the end, being something quite different and inferior to being free. And that D of freed kind of stands as a badge or a mark or the residue of enslavability that we have never erased in this country. It endures till today. Reparations will not solve that problem entirely, because there is other important ideological work we need to do in thinking race in this country, but it is certainly a necessary component of removing that stain of the D, of being freed, as opposed to being free as a matter of natural law, which white people enjoy, and black people and other peoples of color have never enjoyed in this country. So if we were to go back to that period of freedom, and by freedom I spell it in the paper, freedom, well, there's being freed, and then there's freed, I don't even know how to spell it, freedom with a D on the second half of it. And think about what reparations would look like at that point. It takes us back to today, some of the remedies that are being advanced in the Movement for Black Lives platform, which are about collective forms of land ownership, community land trusts, limited equity housing cooperatives, zero equity cooperatives, mutual housing associations, and deed-restricted housing. These are referred to as third sector housing mechanisms that at once preserve equity in the ownership of land, but do so in a way that doesn't entirely surrender to the market and addresses the resource deficiencies of some communities in this country who can't afford buying property at market rates, who don't have intergenerationally accumulated nest eggs that allow them to buy property. So what I like about the Movement for Black Lives platform is that it suggests not writing checks to each person who can show an ancestral connection to an enslaved person. To me, that's a folly. But instead thinks about a collective remedy for a collective injury and does so in a way that assumes collective responsibility for all of us for the deficit of justice that we saw at the time in the 1860s. So what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about Port Royal. Are any of you from South Carolina? And one of you is from North Carolina. Or Mississippi, that's right. Mississippi, Daria. But you're from South Carolina. Are you from this area?
I'm from the...
Okay. Okay, so it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Beautiful area. So this is the area of Port Royal in the 1860s, and these are little northern ships coming in to take Port Royal in 1861. Northern troops, seeing this as a militarily strategic place to interrupt the movement of goods of the Confederate military between Charleston and Savannah. And so it's a strategically very important place. It's an amazing port. It is, now Hilton Head, which I don't know if any of you have been there on vacation or otherwise. It's an extremely wealthy place now. Beautiful, beautiful place. The Sea Islands are gorgeous, and they've been beautifully developed today as certainly vacation destinations, but also just a beautiful place for South Carolinians to live in. But there are 6 islands, basically, that make up the Port Royal area, St. Helena Island being the largest. And this area at the end here was called Coffin's Point, because a guy named Coffin owned a plantation there. It was the largest plantation in the area. But there are really 6 islands, Ladies, Edisto, and these other islands, with the main town being Beaufort right here as the heart of this area. So Northern troops take Port Royal, take this area in 1861. And when they do, they find 10,000 to 15,000 enslaved people working on over 1,000 plantations in this area. So as the white troops come in, Northern troops come in, the white landowners leave. And they cross over to the mainland, and they flee, which is up here, and they flee into the mainland of South Carolina and take refuge there. So the black people are left there, run from the plantations to the safety, although they're a little ambivalent about how much to trust these northern white people, but relative safety of northern troops. And what happens immediately is the joint administration of these plantations by the Treasury Department and the War Department. War Department is obviously managing the military operation. Treasury Department is managing an economic project that gets set up immediately to keep the plantations running. This is cotton and rice plantations that are here in order to fund the war effort, because they're running out of money. So they're going to seize those crops as they go through several growing seasons and sell them for the benefit of the Northern War effort. Also, as the Northern military officials see it, begin an experiment in black free labor. There's an ideological project here as much as there is a military project of a different sort about how free black labor can be more efficient than enslaved black labor. So the abolitionist military and treasury officials who were in this area are administering this new way to think the work on plantations, done by the same people who had done the work as enslaved, but at a wage. So they're paid a wage for their work. They're given rations of food and clothing through 3 planting seasons. And today we would understand those folks living there and working there as refugees. We didn't have that term really then. What they were referred to by Northern soldiers as contrabands. Contraband, as you probably know, is a seizing of property from the enemy, something that they should not have possession of. Usually it's guns and other instruments of war. It can be horses or tanks, that sort of thing. But there was great ambivalence about whether it was politically appropriate to refer to the formerly enslaved people as people right away. Today, as I say, we would refer to them. We recognize them as people and see them as refugees. But they were termed contrabands at that point. So there's a contraband management project that takes place here, managed by the Treasury and the War Department. And then from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, several thousand missionaries come south to manage the education and moral stewardship of the contrabands, or the freed people, the refugees who were living there. And they come in as quite important characters at this point. So the freed people say, we're happy to keep farming. We'd love to work for a wage, but we are not going to grow cotton. They begin breaking the cotton gins, and they plant corn and wheat. They want crops they can eat and feed their families with, not cotton, which has been, to them, the worst form of agricultural work, and in ways stood at the center of what they thought the slavery system stood for. So I have a wonderful quote in the paper from one of the freedmen living there, is that we are never planting cotton for white folks again, as he's stepping on the cotton gins and breaking them. So they're working for a wage, and the federal government breaks their promise, doesn't pay them. The federal government is relatively thin on resources at this point, and so paying black people for agricultural work that they're doing in this area is low on the list of financial priorities coming out of Washington. So they're promised that free labor will mean a wage, but very often they didn't get paid. And a number of the freed people there said that actually, in many ways, work while enslaved was better as work than it was while free. So this is 1861. In early 1862, Congress passes the Confiscation Act, which taxes these properties, these plantations on these 6 islands. And if you don't pay your taxes, the land can be confiscated. And of course, they knew that no one was going to pay their taxes because they had left. They're not there. So this is a way of seizing the land through a taxing regime with the full intent of violating the property rights, and some people would say, of the prior owners of this land. So the land is taxed. Taxes are not paid. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of land are seized by the federal government to manage for this economic and moral project here. But several of the leadership of the military, not the missionaries, interestingly enough, but leadership of the military felt strongly that that land should be redistributed to the freed people as reparation for enslavement. One of them actually said that these people have an equitable mortgage on the land. They are entitled to it. They are, we would say today, they have a sort of security interest in this land. But there were many ways in which this was expressed, not by the missionaries, the do-gooders, the Christian teachers from the North, but the military guys were actually more progressive about this than the missionaries were. And so they took it, these military guys, took it as their project to get the land into the hands of the people who had worked it previously as slaves. And note that the people who had worked here as slaves and then afterwards as free laborers had lived on this, in this area for generations. They had several generations of ancestors buried there. They had been born there. They grew up there. Many of you know about a Gullah dialect, that there was actually they have their own language and cultural traditions. Being island culture, there was something very special about it, as is often the case with island culture. So they were very attached to this place. Not so attached to slavery, of course, but attached to the land. They knew the land better than the northern missionaries did, who were also, in many respects, brought down to supervise some of the work. And they'd never grown cotton. They're from Boston. They're from New York City. They're from Philadelphia. We don't grow cotton there, last I checked. So these people knew how to do the work, and they were very attached to the land because their people, their kin were there. So to reallocate the land to them as a kind of reparation made real sense to them. And they immediately, of course, took to this notion. So what the federal government decided to do was auction off substantial plots of the land, entire plantations, although divided up into smaller pieces, and then preserve some of those parcels, hold them back only for the freed people to auction on, or to bid on them with a reduced price. So they weren't going to have all of the land be auctioned at a free and open auction, because the missionaries, it turned out, had investors in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, who were land speculators, who were there to buy the land as much as they were to attend to the moral stewardship of these freed people. So at the first auction in March of 1863, many tens of thousands of acres were auctioned off, and a few black families in open bidding were able to buy some of the land because they had been selling corn and other crops or other things that they'd been raising on their property, pigs, chickens, things like that, to the northern military, the soldiers who were there. So they'd been making some money, even though they weren't getting paid by the federal government as they had been pledged to be paid. But they did have some income. And so they came together in groups, not just individuals, but largely they reassembled themselves in the kinship groups that had formed during enslavement and bid on this land that they regarded as their land. So about about 3,000 acres were able to be bought by formerly enslaved people at that first auction. You know, out of tens of thousands of acres, it's a small amount. But the way that the law was written for these auctions is that only, what was the expression that they used? Loyal citizens could bid on the land. So here we have freed black people considered, treated as loyal citizens for the first time, even though, of course, they weren't citizens. But they were treated as de facto as citizens, which is remarkable. It's actually the first acts of citizenship throughout the country for formerly enslaved people were through these auctions in the Sea Islands. Edward Philbrick, missionary from up here, who was running Coffin's Point on behalf of this military project, bought at auction 7,000 acres himself, 11 plantations. He had investors from up north who were subsidizing these auctions for him, and he ended up employing, after that first auction, 1,000 black people to work that plantation. And he promised to the people he outbid, the black people he outbid who wanted that land, that's okay, I'm going to hold it for you in trust. And I will sell it to you for $1 an acre, which was about the subsidized price that they were using at the time for black people to bid, for the freed people to bid. I'll sell it to you for $1 an acre a few years from now. You guys aren't really ready to own land yet. So I will model agrarian stewardship for you, and then I'll sell it to you. I won't take a profit on the land. Not surprisingly, that never happened. But that was the promise, and it gained the compliance of freed people to work on his plantations, to his profit, of course, to his benefit. So then let me just fast forward quickly. Next year, there's a second auction. Even more land is auctioned off. Lincoln had, after some strong arguing from the local military officials in the Sea Islands, Lincoln had acquiesced in preserving a large section of that auction for freed people at a reasonable price. Then he reversed that commitment. The land was auctioned again, and it was heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. How freed people would bid up to what they could collectively put together, and then some white person would come in and bid $10 more, and that was the end of it. Plot after plot after plot. They lost the land that they had been promised would be theirs. And would be theirs not only because of their family and kin connections to the land, but had been promised would be theirs as a matter of reparation for slavery. They thought, finally, we can live in an amazing place away from white people. Their aim was to have a kind of self-sufficiency through farming in communities that they were constructing themselves, and the white people would go away. And what ended up happening instead is that northern speculators bought almost all the land. Black people were able to buy small plots here and there, and the long-term effect of that was that because of their attachment to the land, they stayed in the Sea Islands and became a ready and exploitable labor force who could work on these large plantations for the profit of those plantation owners. Because their plots were so small, the freed people weren't actually able to sustain themselves on farming on those size of farms. So what had been promised was taken away. Lee surrenders, of course, to Grant in 1865. Lincoln is assassinated shortly thereafter. And one of the first acts that newly sworn-in President Johnson undertakes is an amnesty proclamation for all of the Confederate whites who had seceded from the nation, from the United States, and the restoration of all their land except enslaved. So they come on back, they get back on their boats, they come back and they say, we want our land back. And the land is given back to them. Even the land that the African Americans, that the black people had bought in auction, is returned to them. So they become a permanent, in a way, the freed people of the Sea Islands become a permanent labor source of course, sort of small farmers who are forced to enter into up to 1-year labor contracts with the people who own, the white people who own these big plantations, and in a kind of legalized servitude, forced labor, in the name of freedom. This is what freedom looks like. Not independent landowners, not any kind of repair for enslavement, but instead contract labor and sharecropping later we see. So let me just tell you one last couple of things, and then I want to hear your questions. 1891, Congress passes an act that says for those white folks who did not return to claim their land, they would get reparations for the seizure of their land during the Confiscation Act at a discounted price, okay, but they got paid for their land. And Edward Philbrick, what did he do? Never gave the land back, never sold it to the freed people who he swore he would. And right now, I'm on my way to South Carolina to get the chain of titles for Coffin's Point in particular. But I certainly know who he sold the land to. The first person was a senator, a U.S. senator from Pennsylvania, who used Coffin Point as a couple times a year as a vacation spot for him and his friends to go hunting and fishing. And the amount of, I mean, as I said at the beginning, what this property is worth now compared to what those auctions looked like in 1862 and 1863. That, to me, is how we price reparations for those people, or is a way to price reparations for the people who were freed in the Sea Islands into a state of freedom, not freedom. So fast forwarding to the claims of the movement for Black Lives and thinking about creative forms of collective or subsidized or trust-based land ownership, it actually looks a lot like what the freed people were trying to do with those auctions. Collective ownership of land as reparation. Not free, but subsidized in some way to make it affordable and to keep it in the community. That's what these new third sector housing or property ownership structures do, is keep it from being entirely alienable in the free market. So that's the very long paper. If you want, I can make it available to you. But that's, I think, one of the most compelling arguments in favor of racial reparations today is to go back to the original moment of emancipation and see the failure of justice at that point. Questions?
Thank you so much.
We've muted the internal mic. That's just for the video.
Really interesting. I'm curious as to, obviously this didn't just happen in the Sea Isles. And from like a mathematical perspective, that's how we would price it here. But how would you think about wanting to extrapolate that to just the broader South or America generally, for how we would go about figuring out the pricing and how to distribute that?
You know, you guys, are you a law student? So, you know, law and economics has totally colonized legal education. When I went to law school, we didn't do that stuff. It came after I went to law school, but now that's what you guys do. But it's not what I do. I leave that to others. I make the moral and historical case. And I think there's a case to be made in the Sea Islands. There's a whole other part of the paper that has to do with an area right outside of Vicksburg and Jefferson Davis's old plantation, Davis Bend. And I tell a slightly different story there. But I think we can go back to the way land in these two places in particular were used explicitly as a form of reparation for enslavement and come up with defensible ways to justify numbers today. But it almost doesn't matter, the number doesn't matter so much as these ways of thinking about how to distribute land to poor communities of color or low-income communities of color today. So maybe you're better at math than I am, so I will leave that to you. But my project is the historical and normative one.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
So I'm wondering, in terms of the moral and historical case, about the legal case, particularly with regard to the original promise. What was the, because when I think about the moral and historical case, I think about promises that get made that are dependent on resources that can be then withdrawn if the resources aren't available, as opposed to a legal case in which there's some sort of coercive force behind it. So I'm wondering about the legal status of the original promise and the legal status of the return to white folks when they come back. And then I'm also wondering about the possibility of a claim of adverse possession for people who are sitting on that land. Because if it's just moral and historical, then people say, oh, yeah, it would have been great, but we don't have resources, and we have these legal obligations to the white folks, et cetera.
Well, there's a lot of good writing on the legality of the Confiscation Act, on the constitutionality of the act and whether it was unconstitutional. I think there's a good case on both sides. It's also a period of war, and stuff gets done during war that is somewhat extra legal. They had seceded from the Union, so the degree to which they would claim rights that were secured under a U.S. Constitution during that period is itself a complicated question, or at least one that's relevant, I think. And then our notions of property ownership and due process, of course, are different today than they were then, and they've evolved in complex ways. So I think that one could marshal a legal argument on either side, and that's the thing about law, is that it tends to give you tools to do that. And that's why I would rather focus on the normative argument that would push you in the direction of particular legal claims. But you know, given that this land was made available to freed people as a form of reparation through a taxation system, I'm all for a mansion tax or a flip tax or a tax on the 1%, you know, some form of tax now to fund this today. If you go online, there are all these great sites about properties that are in foreclosure across the country, farms that are in foreclosure. In the Sea Islands, and actually Coffin's Point, today there are 5 lovely properties in foreclosure. Just right here, right at this beautiful little end right here. They're lovely homes. But there are many, many foreclosed properties in this whole area, and indeed the foreclosure rate in the Port Royal and the Beaufort area is almost double the national average. So these are properties. I mean, if we wanted to do your thing of figuring out how to actually do it today, we could have the government buy those properties and then find resources through taxing flip taxes or mansion taxes. I live in New York City. When you sell an apartment over $1 million, I believe it is, you have to pay a mansion tax. I mean, $1 million is a lot of money, but you don't have to have a mansion. Most things that are $1 million are not mansions anymore in New York. So, but we could have mechanisms for doing that. So that I think would be legal. That don't get them back the exact land that they wanted, but would think today about how to appropriate land in ways that counted as a reparation. You got to give her the mic. Oh, there it is.
Should I use this for this?
Go right ahead, sure.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions. One, so during your project, I think historically, you know, black people have been written out in terms of their agency and actually building coalitions that led to racial progress.
Yep.
So Eric Fonner talks about this a lot. He centralizes black people in terms of really, you know, racial progress in like the Reconstruction era. Versus kind of, I think, the contemporary narrative, which I think you hit on a little bit, which is, you know, enlightened white people that kind of have like a moral awakening. So when you're looking at this period, it's difficult because a lot of the primary sources come from white people. Therefore, those voices have been kind of eliminated. But like, it always gives me pause when I hear things like military folks, you know, that then felt something, if that was them versus folks on the ground, black people are having coalitions, movements, et cetera. And so as a historian, I'm just curious,
Sure.
How do you try to get to those sources when they can just be hard to find or non-existent? So that's question 1. Well, let's do
All right.
question 1 first.
I share your concern as an historian, and we have other historians in the room, I think, who share the same concern about how the sources are always the elites, who are usually white, but it depends on the context you're looking at. And so in my last book, In Wedlocked, which is also goes into a granular detail of racial history at the end of the war around marriage, and in this project, I do the best I can to privilege the voices of black people. Now, those voices are often written down by white people. As you know, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. And so the literacy rates were very, very low in the communities that I look at. But there actually is quite a lot of primary materials that recount the testimony, the comments, the conversations of formerly enslaved people, of how they felt about what was happening, and how creative they were in managing this transition. So, for instance, one of the things, when Philbrick and his crew ended up buying up most of the land, at some point they ran out of money, and then they started auctioning off the chattel, the horses, the plows, the shovels, things like that. And that stuff was left for the black people to buy. It was cheaper, and the white folks had run out of money. So I just have I think it's a wonderful part of the paper, discussing how they discussed doing that. And at one point, they bought a mule, and they named it after Philbrick, and did just fun stuff like that too. But like stuff where they're saying something with the way that they're exercising the rights that they have. So I try to lift up those voices primarily and fill in with the voices of the white folks who were the do-gooders there, the enlightened ones, where need be. But as an historian, I don't know if you are as well, working in this period, it's a concern, what your resources, what the archive has available. But there's a surprising amount of the voices of freed people that you can access. You have another brief question, or do you want to yield and come back?
I'll yield.
All right.
Hi there. I have a question about your comments on the benefits of collective ownership, especially now in terms of implementing some of these reparation ideas or concepts. What is the purpose of your stress on this point? Is it a feasibility issue? Is it about effective management? Because, to be honest, it does echo to some extent this historical story of northern management of lands during this period.
So what is the point? I'm sorry, I missed the take-home point question.
What is the point of stressing the collectively managing reparations today and collectively managing lands that might be included in modern reparation?
Well, I mean, I would encourage you to go back and read the Black Lives Matter platform if you haven't. But in many respects, they're seeing, or they're calling for community solutions to what are community-based problems or collective problems. So they're resisting the idea to atomize a few black success stories, and instead redistribute wealth and resources back into communities rather than to a lucky few. There were a lucky few here, but we would be reproducing that again if we were to just create an individual landowning system now, where those who were able to get resources were able to take advantage of it. So it's really a collectivizing both responsibility and what the remedy looks like. And read the platform. It's good. It's good stuff. I completely forgot I had more slides. I'm so bad at PowerPoint. So just like, so here you go. There's I took time doing this, so I'm going to show you. So these are the boats landing, the military boats landing in Beaufort. Here's a family on the Smith plantation combing the cotton after it's been harvested. You can get a sense here of how people lived. And why does that tree look like that? Is that people are trying to figure out how to heat their homes based on what's in the yard, right? That's how poor and how under-resourced they are. Here's a family, 5 generations of folks in Beaufort standing in front of their home. And this is part of testifies to how much people were attached to this area, that their families were buried there. Their ancestors were, and they felt them. They communicated with them. Here's some more of the homes of the folks that were working there and living there. And then this, I just wanted to end with her. I mean, the captions I'm using are the ones that the Library of Congress uses. I would not use that term, but that's what it is. I just love her walking away from her house there. So we're not talking about wealthy people, of course. Freed people were extremely impoverished. But just to get a feeling for what the place felt like, I would be remiss if I didn't show you my slides. OK, next question. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. It was really wonderful.
Thank you for coming.
The only experience that I've had with Gullah people is from the cultural heritage kind of perspective. And it's my understanding that the U.S. Park Service has a project going on with Gullah populations that might be a good mechanism for what you're proposing in terms of reparations, because they do get a budget from Congress and could hypothetically get the land back. But do you think that it's more effective to approach this idea of reparations through, like, National Park Service, or do you think that it would be better to go through, say, like a congressman in South Carolina, especially for like the Sea Islands, which I like from the people that I've talked to, they told me about all these foreclosed properties. And
yeah, the economy's kind of rough there.
And it's really rough. And so it actually, I mean, as unfortunate as that is, it provides a really good launching pad for getting land back for people.
Right, and one of the complications of this is that many of the foreclosed properties, some of them were owned by African-American people.
Yeah.
So you're redistributing land within the black community. So I mean, there's stuff to be worked out here, right, of how this looks. But I don't think I would have the Park Service work on this, because it's not that I want to set up a museum of injustice, which is what they do, sort of. I think this should be a project of, you know, the Treasury or of HHS, or set up a special commission, national commission, to deal with this. And with the way that African American people have become internally displaced people within this country more generally, moving out of the South to other parts of the country. I don't know, how many of you have seen 13th yet? Right, I mean, incredibly moving, and one of the amazing visuals they have that Anna DuVernay has in this film is of, you know, dots of people moving out of the South, as she describes it, as refugees from violence, or maybe it was Jelani Cobb that was describing it. But in any event, the folks that live there, then many of them have left. Not surprisingly, and so I wouldn't want to restrict reparations to who's still there. They may not have been. They might have moved there recently, but I wouldn't say that they would have a priority of claims. But it's just returning to this history, which many people don't know, in order to justify a larger national project that I'm up to here. But I mean, if you've been down to those museums, they're pretty cool. They're worth visiting.
Yeah, they're cool, and I think that a good argument for cultural heritage is that it does bring the conversation back. In terms of like having people acknowledge these people and acknowledge the humanity of these people and see like where their origins are from, and kind of help lend credence to your argument from like a standpoint of like they have been here for a very, very long time, and in many ways are entitled to the land in a way that a lot of other people aren't as well.
The perverse consequence at times, though, of that way of thinking, our history, is that it operates as an alibi for responsibility today. It's like we look back at that and we sort of freeze that moment back then and don't connect the dots to the circumstances today, which is what many scholars are doing, but Coates certainly did in that Atlantic article, and I think DuVernay is doing in 13th.
Not a law student, I'm an archivist. But I was wondering how the idea of reparations might be applied to what happened in the 20th century in the Sea Islands, where real estate people came in and really coerced people to sell their land for way undervalued prices in some really horrible ways.
Yes.
For all of that beautiful development that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop in 1863 or 1891. It does continue, and that's certainly the argument of movement for Black lives. And that's, I think, a larger project would certainly bring those sorts of land speculation and coercive sales questions to bear as well. But it's because the allocation of land was undertaken specifically as an idea of reparations in this period that I wanted to focus on that. I think there's maybe different arguments that one would make about what happened in the 19th century, but they're not unrelated. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. It's okay, just talk.
No. One comment and one question. So I wonder if you have thought at all about looking at foreclosure crisis 2008-2012 and what sort of creative options occurred there in terms of returning properties back to some sort of community ownership. I know it happened here in Boston with Boston Community Capital purchasing properties and then renting or selling back to families who had particularly low incomes, or the Chicago land banking program. So I'm wondering if that would be something of interest to look at. And then a question relates to your thoughts about settlements as reparations, so actual legal settlements as reparation, as opposed to some legislative action, which I think we all know is unlikely, unfortunately, because of Congress being
dysfunctional.
Congress. Yes. So I'm curious about that sort of legal strategy for reparations. I'm thinking especially of in-rate black farmers and the USDA settlements that some people called reparations, though we can argue about that. But that kind of mechanism as reparations.
Great comments and reflections on this. It's these contemporary, really creative movements to seize land in trust form and reallocate it that inspired me in a way to think this project. It's happening in Baltimore too now. They're in Detroit, the big areas of the city that are just not happening anymore. New Orleans. We could see a similar kind of trust-based or collective ownership-based public-private partnerships in a way in the cities where there is so much blight, and not only because of 2008 and the foreclosure crisis, but certainly amplified by that. So yes, I'm thinking about that. But I'm more of an historian, so I'm not as good at that piece. And I know there are a lot of people who are really good at that stuff. So I will give this to them and let them figure that part out. And you may be that person who has figured that out. So great, do that. And then as with respect to litigation, I think that there's so many issues that make litigation difficult, or well, you can always sue, but winning. And I love those suits. But they're going to be that many of them that I think will be successful. But I wouldn't say do this and not that. I think it's a both and kind of situation. Part of the other problem that's happened with black land ownership that Thomas Mitchell works on a lot is the fact that those people who did get land in this period that I'm interested in, or even later, very often didn't have wills. So they would die, and they had a number of children. And so the land would be then divided between, let's say, 8 or 10 heirs. They would die, and each of their heirs would inherit a share. And so there are these problems of land ownership throughout the South, black land ownership, where the ownership is so diversified among people who don't know each other, may not get along, don't even know they own it. And he's doing really interesting work, I think, in trying to reassemble some kind of coherent ownership of that land so that it can be, and much of it is abandoned in many cases. But I would commend you to read his work and the activism he's doing in those cases as well.
So I think you kind of touched on some of this stuff in answering other questions, but I'm just curious.
Ask it in a new and provocative way.
So I'm curious, whether just strategically it makes sense for some of these movements. So the case for reparations, I think on a national level, just seems so at odds with kind of where society stands. And so using this as like, we can kind of point historically to this time period and then, organize that argument specifically to this region, specifically to this, to stuff like this. I wonder if it makes sense for reparations strategically kind of have small coalitions in different places that are like this. It's not this national kind of large-scale argument, but, and in the North, I think you could have those arguments because it's not, when I think of reparations, I think cool tied to slavery, but every generation since then, you're having these huge wealth gaps where you're not able to make, to basically capitalize on GI Bill, capitalize on other policies because of racial divides, and I think you could make potentially localized arguments there. I don't know if that's been something that's come up or.
No, I think that the activists that are working on this and the scholars that are working on it are trying to decide whether a wholesale or retail approach to it would be most successful. And given the dysfunction of our national government, which maybe it will change radically in November, but who knows what we're going to get. And even if we had democratic control of all three branches, I'm not sure this would be at the top of their agenda, right? So it may be local measures would be the way to approach it. And we're seeing that across a range of issues, whether it's labor rights or immigration. Those sorts of issues are actually, there's much more innovation happening on the local level than on the national level. And part of what I find so troubling about bills like HB2 in North Carolina and there's a similar bill in Mississippi is that besides being transphobic and homophobic, what's also in these bills is a preemption by the state of local innovation on the municipal level in the labor and immigration area. And that's that kind of way of rendering legally impossible the kinds of innovation that I think you would favor is something to keep an eye on. With these state bills that are labeled as anti-trans bills, and they are that, but they're doing much more too. So I think some of this we could also think about. I think somebody like Mayor de Blasio in New York would probably be interested in this kind of idea. And there's some progressive politicians in North and South Carolina as well. Mississippi, yeah. There's always work to do in Mississippi. So it might be something regional, rather than just municipal. It's a good question, a tactical question. It's a good one. Hey, you guys got to go to class. Thank you. Thank you.